The end of the Cold War brought peace to Europe, and armies began to demobilize. The American Empire exploited this trust and ignored promises made to the Russians to expand NATO and absorb former Warsaw Pact nations and even former Soviet republics. Efforts then focused on conquering the large former Soviet Republic of Ukraine. The Russians had found Ukraine unproductive, corrupt, and troublesome, so granted it independence in 1991. The American Empire plotted to absorb Ukraine into NATO and sent military units to Ukraine to bolster the Ukrainian army, with plans for building American military bases there. This culminated with an American-instigated coup in Ukraine in 2014 that led to bloody fighting and major economic disruptions. Ukraine is a new nation with complex problems caused by borders drawn during the Soviet era. In 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Poland and seized half of its land. This area was invaded by Germany 2 years later, which formed Ukrainian military units that murdered over 100,000 Poles during the war. After World War II, the Polish regions were formally annexed by Soviet Ukraine after 1.5 million Poles were forcibly deported. Over the next decade, another 1.5 million Poles were deported to ethnically cleanse these regions. Eastern Ukraine includes a large number of ethnic Russians, who are the majority in the Donbass region that was attached to Ukraine in 1922. Russian Crimea was added in 1954. The Russians in these regions were not consulted since Ukraine was ruled by Moscow. Russians and Ukrainians coexisted peacefully until the American Empire began to promote Ukrainian nationalism. Russians were blamed for Ukraine's economic problems, and the solution promoted was to join NATO and the European Union. As the American Empire conquered Eastern Europe, it dispatched non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that pretended to act as charities but were secretly funded to instigate protests and riots. These were employed in the successful coups in Serbia and Georgia, and included American billionaire George Soros's Open Society Foundation and the Washington-based Freedom House, whose chairman was former CIA Director James Woosley. These coups involved generous financing from the U.S. government's National Endowment for Democracy, an agency created by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s to topple governments. Ukrainian Premier Viktor Yanukovych rejected the idea of joining NATO, so the American Empire dispatched its NGOs to instigate protest and random violence. This was a huge effort that involved $5 billion in funding. Victoria Nuland was Vice President Dick Cheney's foreign policy advisor. She somehow became Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs in the Obama administration and openly orchestrated a coup.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce to you the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Victoria Nuland. Victoria just recently returned from Kiev and has an update on the situation there, as well as the U.S. government position. Victoria?
Still jet-lagged from my third trip in 5 weeks to Ukraine and my days in Kyiv earlier this week. I don't have to tell this crowd that these are historic and challenging times for the people of Ukraine, for the Ukrainian-American relationship, and for people everywhere who care about the future of that great country. The world is watching the drama that is unfolding in the center of Kyiv. The Euromaidan movement has come to embody the principles and values that are the cornerstones for all free democracies. What began on November 24th as a protest against President Yanukovych's decision to pause on the route to Europe, we've invested over $5 billion to assist Ukraine in these and other goals that will ensure a secure and prosperous and democratic Ukraine. Today, there are senior officials in the Ukrainian government, in the business community, as well as in the opposition, civil society, and the religious community who believe in this democratic and European future for their country. And they've been working hard to move their country and their president in the right direction.
Nuland is seen here with American Secretary of State John Kerry in February 2014, meeting with Ukrainian coup plotters in Germany. The Americans selected Ukrainian's next prime minister, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, pictured across from Kerry. Yats is our guy, Nuland declared in a phone call to U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt. When Pyatt warned that many European countries were uncomfortable with the Ukrainian coup, she shot back, quote, "Fuck the EU." Nuland's phone call was secretly recorded and released, causing great embarrassment to the Obama administration. Nuland and Ambassador Pyatt openly encouraged protests and passed out snacks to dupe protesters in the Ukrainian capital just before the coup. Ukrainian Premier Viktor Yanukovych refused to order troops to fire on the mobs and fled as Nuland's team took over Ukraine. Her arrogance shocked diplomats and European leaders. The coup led to violence and killed European support for admitting Ukraine into the European Union and NATO. Absorbing Ukraine would weaken European security and provide no economic benefit. The American empire was furious, as their spokesman later revealed during President Trump's impeachment hearings when they made absurd claims to justify the coup.
Our strategic aim for the entirety of my Foreign Service career is not possible without a Ukraine whole, free, and at peace.
Ukraine is a strategic partner of the United States, important for the security of our country, as well as Europe. Ukraine is on the front line in the conflict with the newly aggressive Russia.
Millions of Ukrainians refused to accept the overthrow of their democratic government by the American empire. Ethnic Russians protested and hundreds were beaten and some killed by Ukrainian nationalists. Russians in eastern Ukraine took up arms and blocked roads into their region. American Vice President Joe Biden arrived in Ukraine in April 2014 to encourage a so-called anti-terrorist operation against Russian rebels. Russia provided some military equipment to help these militias, but refused to intervene directly. The Ukrainian army was dispatched to crush these rebels, but retreated after some bloody clashes, resulting in a stalemate. Ukraine's trade with Russia was disrupted and caused more economic problems. Russia announced that it would no longer provide natural gas to Ukraine at a heavily discounted rate. Ukraine would have to pay the European rate, which it could not afford. The Ukrainian economy suffered as its citizens became aware of the American coup. Russia did not want to rule Ukraine, which is why it allowed independence. Nevertheless, the American empire claimed that Russia had invaded Ukraine and caused the bloodshed. American corporate media lies when it states that Russia invaded Crimea. This region was part of Russia since 1783, until it was administratively attached to Ukraine in 1954 by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, a Ukrainian, to promote Soviet solidarity. Russians are the majority people in Crimea, and Russian is the common language. The 1997 Russian-Ukrainian partition agreement allowed Russia to keep 25,000 troops in Crimea for defensive purposes. In 2014, after years of Ukrainian political turmoil and an American coup, Russia accepted a request by the Republic of Crimea to rejoin Russia after 94% of its citizens voted in favor. Russian troops didn't invade Crimea, they were already there. Crimeans were puzzled by intense American opposition to this reannexation, and rightly concluded the Americans wanted NATO military bases in strategic Crimea. Adding Ukraine to NATO remains attractive to the American empire, since it's the second largest nation in Europe by area, with 42 million people. The United States has provided Ukraine with $1.5 billion in military aid since 2014, to include $250 million in 2019. A search of the U.S. Army's website provides a list of 349 news articles, linked below, about U.S. Army operations in Ukraine in just the past 5 years. The 2014 American coup in Ukraine was an act of war against its people that toppled its democratically elected government. Permanent American military bases in Ukraine may eventually appear, but America's leading warmonger, Senator John McCain, was furious that Crimeans escape. In 2014, he openly expressed disappointment at the lack of political support for NATO military action against Russia to conquer Crimea, even though it may have resulted in a world war.
So we have no military obligation here to defend Ukraine. And do you think there is a military option, even if we had an obligation?
I'd love to tell you that there is, Andrea, but frankly, I do not see it. I'm glad to see our U.S. military naval presence in the Black Sea. Again, I wish that there were, but